So I want to really thank EFF. One of my friends is pretty involved with EFF. She's their head attorney and their executive director, and I don't think that had anything to do with why they came here. But I want to thank Sandy Cohn for letting you guys come and for being part of our public interest in CivicXR. And I'm super excited for you guys to talk about this. I'm so glad that you came all the way here from San Francisco. So welcome them. And
let's do it.
So welcome to, actually, can we go back to this?
Oh, sure, there you go.
Spot the Surveillance, which is how EFF is taking on Big Brother. And I'm Laura Shatskin. I'm a web developer at EFF. I work on our digital activism sites, and I've worked in tech for about 20 years. I was a freelancer before I was at EFF, focusing on nonprofits, and I'm also an artist. Dave?
Yeah, so I'm a senior investigative researcher at EFF. I tend to describe myself as a muckraker and a noisemaker, and I focus on criminal justice issues, transparency, and surveillance issues. And my background is in investigative journalism, but I kind of first picked up VR stuff at San Diego Comic-Con a few years back, and that is kind of where we are, sort of led us on our mission today. I'm just going to, before we get into any of the VR stuff, I'm going to take you a little bit through what EFF does. I know most of you know who we are, but some of you don't, as well as some of the underlying issues of the VR project we're working on. So EFF, we're based in San Francisco. We are an international nonprofit that works at the intersection of human rights, civil liberties, and technology. So that could range from mass surveillance issues like the NSA spying on everyone. It can be censorship on social media platforms. We do a lot with consumer privacy these days. We file a lot of Freedom of Information Act lawsuits. And we also do some intellectual property things, defending fair use, busting patents. Encryption is a big thing. We also provide legal advice to those who work in the InfoSec community. And obviously we work on net neutrality, which is one of the biggest battles we've been fighting in the last couple of years. We kind of split into three different disciplines at EFF. One of them is impact litigation. We sue a lot of government agencies. We sue a lot of things in general. We sometimes get to go to court over it. Sometimes they just fold and let us win without ever having to go into a courtroom. We also have a team of technologists who devise what I'm reluctant to call them products because nobody buys them. They are free open source tools, but a lot of them are for your browser, like Privacy Badger, which blocks third-party cookies. CertBot makes it very simpler and much cheaper to get security certificates for your websites. We also have researchers who study vulnerabilities and study privacy issues with apps. And research state-sponsored malware. So that's when the Ethiopian government is going after activists by inserting malware on their computers to spy on them. We also have an activism team that works on public education campaigns, but also to get legislation passed. And we really do pride ourselves on trying new ways to go about this, as opposed to just the traditional letter writing campaigns. So sometimes it's, we were, some of the folks really developing the tools out there for emailing your members of Congress. But we'll also do things like team up with Greenpeace to sail an airship over the NSA data center in Utah. We put out a science fiction collection a few years back. We had cosplayers at Dragon Con hold up signs and take pictures. And we also have a new thing that started a couple years ago called the Electronic Frontier Alliance, which is now it's a coalition of grassroots groups around the country, some of which were pre-existing, some of which we helped mentor people to form to sort of deal with these issues on a local level. I particularly work on EFF's street-level surveillance project, which is looking at the types of technologies that local law enforcement, and sometimes federal law enforcement, but we're really specifically concerned with local law enforcement, deploy in our communities. That could be, I'm going to actually go through it. So drones. Drones are one of the ones that really kicked this off. When I first started at EFF in 2013, people were talking about drones all the time. Who's got drones? CBP has got drones. But over the last few years, local law enforcement has really started acquiring these on a really major level. The BARD Institute has a really incredible map of all the public safety drones around the country. There are hundreds of agencies that have them. Body-worn cameras also suddenly exploding. Like, I was at a police chief's conference a few months ago where there was a room asking about how to institute a body-worn camera, what are the best practices, and at the beginning of the panel they asked who has body cameras, and about half the audience raised their hand, and then they asked who's going to be getting body cameras soon, and then the rest of the audience raised their hand. So it's pretty ubiquitous. And in the sense of 360-degree technology, we have a police force that is now like the world's most prolific cinematography association. These are just some images that the Seattle Police Department has a YouTube channel where they post their surveillance footage from body cameras as they're going around and collecting it. Face recognition is another thing we work on. A few years ago, face recognition was fairly limited to a handheld device or a phone app that you would point at specific people to try to run them against a mugshot database. These days, with Amazon and IBM getting into the game, they're trying to do real-time analysis of face recognition, using it to track people. And then the one I probably work on the most is automated license plate readers, which is a technology that either are cameras mounted on vehicles or on on street lights that look for license plates. When they see a license plate, it kind of digitizes it, adds the GPS and the location the time date stamp to it, and then so police can go to a database, and if they're interested in what vehicles visited a certain location, they can put in an address and see what vehicles visited that. Or if they want to know where a specific person has been, they can put in your license plate and see a historical mapping of your travel patterns. And then there's good old-fashioned surveillance cameras, just in general. This is a data set we got from the San Francisco District Attorney's Office of their entire list of surveillance cameras. It's not all the surveillance cameras in San Francisco, but it is several thousand of them. And what we're seeing a lot these days is law enforcement getting access to these internet streams off these cameras and networking them through real-time crime centers. So why does this matter? I could probably talk for a full hour just about this slide in particular, and this is just like the things that once I filled up the page, I stopped. But it does chill our ability to explore identities, to just sort of go about our lives without feeling like somebody is watching us, and chilling our ability to just be free. But it also can impact First Amendment rights. The more technology police acquire, the more cybersecurity infrastructure it needs, and police just buy things and don't think about those long-term consequences. There are police who, I don't know if you're surprised to hear this or not, but sometimes police abuse the technology they have to spy on their ex-wives, or like look up their neighbor. There's a lot of things that happen. But then, what we're seeing more and more is that this technology disproportionately impacts religious and ethnic minority groups and economically disadvantaged groups, and it's kind of this loop that the more surveillance equals more policing, and more policing equals more surveillance, and it just keeps going, but only in particular neighborhoods. Now, one of the challenges we face is that too often our work looks like this. We get a lot of paper, and we get a lot of text, and there's a lot of redaction boxes, and we kind of just chuck it at people, and we maybe do blog posts, or we upload documents to our website. Or you just have to stand here and watch me talk on a PowerPoint presentation. And so what we'd really like to do is have it more like this, where we're contextualizing it within our communities so people are able to see not only the things that we're talking about and the problems and the records, but actually see where it functions in the world. So finally, I'll get onto some VR stuff. So a brief history of EFF and VR. This is John Perry Barlow, who passed away this year, but he was one of our founders and was a sort of a pioneer in digital rights and technology. And in 1990, he wrote this essay called Being in Nothingness about him trying VR, and he welcomed the world to virtual reality. And then we're going to jump 25 years into the future. And this is kind of when we started looking at VR again. And we were looking at two specific questions. One of which is, what are the digital rights implications of virtual reality technology on society, particularly related to privacy? And that's a whole different talk we can do, or you can talk to me at some other point. But the one I want to focus on is number 2, which got improperly numbered today. Is what is the potential for virtual reality as an advocacy and educational tool? But on the privacy stuff, let's just linger on the privacy issue for a second here. The Intercept has a really great article from a couple of years back that I recommend reading that's about virtual reality being an incredibly threatening type of digital surveillance and privacy invasion. And a lot of that is because of biometrics. And we're kind of looking at several tiers of biometric collection. And one is just sort of the basic thing of VR, checking where your head's moving and how far your hand is from your head. More advanced is when they start adding breath and eye tracking and facial expression tracking. And then what gets super creepy is when companies are like, well, let's just throw things in front of this person to make them do something, and then we can measure what their reaction is to a whole bunch of other stuff in the world. And then augmented reality is going to present even further things, particularly as technology starts scanning the environment around them and then bouncing that off servers to try to recognize what's in that world. One of the other things I found interesting recently is that there was a talk that I was at the Stanford's Virtual Reality Identity and Privacy Summit, and then it turned out that 90% of VR users do already take some steps in their digital lives to protect their data, and that on the whole, while they were comfortable with companies using their biometric data to develop their products, they were not cool with it being sold, whether that was anonymized or not. So on the issue of VR as an advocacy tool, we were not the first advocacy group or nonprofit group to start getting into VR. Planned Parenthood has a pretty intense VR experience called Across the Line that shows trying to obtain access to an abortion clinic. PETA goes to college campuses with its VR headsets to show people what it's like to be a cow in a factory farm. And Stanford has a pretty cool experience called the 1,000-Cut Journey, which puts you in the body of a young black male and various points in his life as he's encountering racism. And so that brings us to Spot the Surveillance. I think I'm going to pass this on to you now.
So what we created is Spot the Surveillance, which is a virtual reality experience that uses simulation to teach people how to identify various spying technologies that the police may deploy in their communities. So when we started to discuss what we'd like in a VR experience for EFF, these were some of the things we focused on, and I'm going to go into each of these in more depth. A meaningful advocacy experience, something that does not collect biometrics, easy to access on different platforms and devices, open source with an eye on accessibility, so we want to be inclusive to a variety of communities, and on a modest budget. So for meaningful advocacy experience, what we need for that is that we don't want to just rely on the novelty vector of VR. We want to create something that is really appropriate for the VR technology. We want to present our research in a way that only VR can provide. So instead of the wall of text kind of situation that Dave described, something that's going to be more meaningful and immersive. We wanted the people to be active participants in the experience and also to learn new information that's going to last when they go back to the real world. EFF has stringent policies for how we treat data from visitors to our website, so even more so, we're not going to want to collect any biometric data. So we have a challenge, which we want to create a functional experience responsive to physical movements, but not to record them. We wanted it to be cross-platform and open source. So that's, in general, what we do is when we create technology, we want to have it be as accessible to the world as we can. We want it to be something that's not just something you would use in a headset, but maybe even a browser or in a cardboard, not dependent on app stores, and built with technology that can be reused. For accessibility, even though we tend to think of virtual reality as a very visual experience, we wanted to make sure that we had an experience that could be somewhat used by and accessed by low vision users, low mobility users, and also anyone with some sort of language barrier to English. And we wanted to do it cheaply, so we didn't have a big budget. We wanted to create something that was worth our time to put the energy into it. So it's a small team, which is really basically the two of us.
So the concept with Spot the Surveillance is you are placed into a street scene. It's actually in the Western Addition neighborhood of San Francisco, where there's a police encounter going on. And you are tasked with looking around for various pieces of surveillance technology, and as you find one, information is provided to you about what the technology is and how police use it. And the goals for this are, a few beyond just like trying to see whether we can actually do a VR project. One of them is that we just want to be able to educate people on what each of these technologies are. We already have a website that kind of explains it, but maybe this is another way to deliver it. Another thing is just teaching people where to look for this stuff in their communities. So I think that when, once you start studying this technology, you start seeing it everywhere. You start seeing it on the street poles and be like, oh, at the entrance of my gated community or the entrance of this mall, there's a license plate reader. And so we wanted people to be able to like get in the habit of being able to identify this technology. But then third is that there are a lot of people having police encounters either through police stops or maybe they're in a protest situation, and those situations are very high stress, they go very quickly, but it can be useful for someone in that situation to note the various surveillance technologies. Is the police officer wearing a body camera? Was there a surveillance camera on the police vehicle? And so being able to have that experience and practice it in a controlled environment, maybe, at least our hope is that maybe that will help people later on, when they are in a high stress situation, to kind of be able to do that kind of identification.
So one of our decisions, we decided to code this in A-frame because if you're not familiar with A-frame, it's developed by Mozilla to be an easy but powerful VR way to develop VR content. And it's open source and it's based on top of HTML. So basically kind of like an overall framework built on these other technologies. And the projects will be browser-based that you create with A-frame, so we don't need to have people download an app, and also that it can be part of EFF's main website. And A-frame supports most VR headsets, and so that was good for us also. We have found that working with free and open source always has its drawbacks, in that when we were demoing today, all of a sudden there were some bugs coming from the 3JS library, so learning that can happen from time to time. For accessibility, for low vision users, we decided that when there was information being visually displayed, we'd also have a narration to go with it, and also when something is spotted in the experience, that there would be an audio cue as well as a visual cue. And that we made it gaze-based so that you just use your head to control the experience. You don't have to hold a controller, and we're hoping that will help with people who might have limitations on handheld devices. And creating the experience, so just briefly, I showed up one day, Dave had VR set up, I put on the headset, and I was just like, this is fantastic. And I started thinking, how could we create a VR experience for EFF? So with about 10 minutes experience in VR, I got permission to figure out how to write the code and how to even plan out the experience. And part of that was, I'm going to talk a little bit more about mock-ups and location spotting and taking the 360 photographs. But here I'll just go over, like, we had to figure out, well, how are we going to make who are we going to record for the audio or make the sound in the audio? And I had to learn how to write A-frame, and Dave had to come up with the content, including any visual assets, which we got through Creative Commons fair use. And also user texting, because we want to do human-centered design. We want to make sure that our concept is really easily usable by the average person. So this is like my first rudimentary mock-ups. Because I'm an artist, I originally started drawing scenarios, and then I was just like, oh, I could just use Google Street View. Let's just speed up the process. So, what I read was that you should start with like a bird's eye view, which is the top image, and the yellow ring indicates that things that are further than 20 meters away aren't easy to spot. And so you're thinking about, like, where are we going to put devices in the environment so that they're close but a little challenging. And then on the bottom is 2 views of my idea of a point of view scene where you would look at something and then there would be a pop-up indicating more information.
So, ever since the Ricoh Theta S came out, this has been one of the primary cameras that I carry with me everywhere. And so we ended up deciding to go with, instead of trying to illustrate anything or create 3D graphics, we just went with the Ricoh Theta V at the time. And what we found from it is that people have responded well to the realism of it, and that they're not having to deal with this uncanny valley problem that a lot of the other nonprofits have had to do. They create fake environments, and that's just provided a hurdle to it. And so using even what is like a consumer level camera seemed to actually really enhance the experience for people, and it actually worked really well for us. So I considering we're doing it mostly with the Oculus Go, the resolution of the Theta V was just fine.
So this is, we walked around San Francisco looking at various street corners to figure out what would work in terms of something that had surveillance in it, but it was not too visually dense or too visually sparse to be our background image. And we ended up on this street corner in the western edition of San Francisco, which happened to be in front of a police station. And as we were shooting, the police came out talking to a citizen, and we got them in the photo. We're at the bottom of the scene photographing. Dave's holding the camera above his head, and they were ignoring us if we're not even there, which was fantastic. This is so after my mock-up, I handed it off to the UX designer, and she came up with more finalized graphics. So this is an example of one of the information cards that the user sees once they spot a device, in this case a biometric device. And this is an example of how it looks in the scene. When the user spots the body-worn camera, they get to see more information, which is also read to them about the body-worn camera. I did a lot of the work this summer, and at that time I was in the XR studio, which was a residency by Mozilla for 30 women to work in XR, also artificial intelligence and machine learning. So it wasn't so much of a hands-on or teaching type of residency. It was more just a way for women to get together and see what we each were working on, and kind of support each other and bounce off ideas. And then we got a grant from Journalism 360 to keep building out the experience, which we're very excited about. And then we launched on November 5th.
Yeah, so we, people familiar with who Aaron Swartz is? Yeah. So, every year since Aaron Swartz's passing, we've participated with the Internet Archive in a hackathon, which is a series of talks and people coding things. And so we decided to launch this as part of that experience, because they actually have built a Aaron Swartz VR museum, and so it just sort of made sense. That's Brewster Kale, founder of the Internet Archive, trying out our experience. And it's been pretty good so far. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah. In addition for us doing it at tables and doing it at conferences, which is going to be one of the main ways we interact with people, it is also available online. We don't really know when people are using it or not, because we don't track that kind of thing. But it was nice to see someone on Twitter all the way, it doesn't get much further than Portland, Maine from San Francisco. And so it was nice to see that somebody else in a space just like this was trying it out. We saw a few other people on Twitter trying it out. My favorite is this middle one. VR tech is so effing rad. I just went spinning through my apartment, pinging spy tech on the screen of my tracking device. LOL sob. And I think LOL sob is exactly what we're going for with this. That's like the right reaction.
So next step is we're going to continue to do demos where we have the opportunity to do so we can help educate people about this issue, but also to get user feedback. And we are going to have we're going to particularly seek out people in the disability communities to help us figure out if we're doing accessibility right in VR, and also just in general to get feedback so we can improve experience, get rid of bugs, add features, make it smoother. Then we're going to have a second launch in April 2019. And after that, we're hoping for wider activism deployment. So like the EFA chapters that we mentioned earlier, we're hoping that they can take headsets out into their communities and educate their communities wherever they are in the 27 states that they're in. And here's our info if you want to contact us. I guess you do.
One thing I want to underline is that Laura is the only coder we had working on this, and this was all done in under a year. And so I think that's really quite impressive. Does anybody have any questions, or do we have time for questions?
Yeah.
So government surveillance is a good target because it happens on the street, and you could point out a lot of different places where it's happening. But what about corporate surveillance? Do you have ideas for how you might be able to take on a project like this for that?
We do have ideas for that. We're hoping that there's going to be other versions and phases of this. And so one idea was that we'd have another scene, which was like you're in a home office, and how are you being watched in the home office? So that is an idea that we've been playing with amongst like the 5 possibilities.
Another thing is that this wouldn't be for us to make, but Mozilla makes this plugin for Firefox called Lightbeam, which is really cool if you've ever played around with it. But basically, you install it into your Firefox browser, and then you can open up a window, and as you're visiting websites, it'll create like a constellation of the websites and all of the third-party trackers that are watching you, and then they kind of connect each other as they go, and they're kind of dynamic. And I've talked to them a million times saying, like, this would be a perfect VR experience. If you make this into a VR where people can like play with it in the air, I can actually demo that. And so hopefully, I've heard on and off that they're interested in that, and so maybe if they actually make it, that would be another way to deal with this issue you're talking about.
Other questions?
Could you put your contact information up there?
Yeah.
This is great job, by the way. I can't help but thinking though that like at scale it would be useful for the populace to have access to basically the arbitrary version of the screen that you mocked up where you're pointing at the camera. So I'm thinking that like the ultimate evolution of this, either from EFF or elsewhere, is a counterintelligence database of those cameras, and an open source way of or platform to store that data and allow users to know when they're walking down the street with a AR device where those cameras are. Mm-hmm. I mean, I understand that that has its own sort of issues to it, sure. But I mean, what's more? I don't know. I feel like that'd be more useful for somebody who's walking out on the street, not realizing that in any daily life wherever they are, there's a lot of cameras pointed on them, a lot of sensors.
Like you could create a monocle, like monocle in Yelp, like something like that, where you're basically, you turn whatever direction, you just see the camera, right?
So you all just described another version of this we'd like to build. That's right.
Yeah. There's, I feel like I've heard that a lot of people have brought up a similar suggestion to this, and there are just so many challenges to that it's a little daunting to me, because not just like how do you actually identify it? Like how would you identify it even without the AR component? And that in itself is difficult. And then I start thinking about it in my head, I'm like, well, how are we going to do AR scanning the environment and that's still being okay with our privacy policy? And that also creates another challenge. But we are sort of like looking at like, well, what kind of ways can we map out what kind of technologies are being used in various communities? You saw the sort of Google Maps that I have of the camera database for San Francisco, and that's like one of the first times I've been able to get a data set like that of just individual pieces of equipment. And so I'm dealing with like a challenge enough of like just how to get that out there in a useful fashion.
If people can find Pokemon, they'll be able to find the cameras.
Well, yeah, but then once they move it, it's like keeping it going is a bit difficult. But but I think there's something there.
They might have a bigger budget too.
Niantic does
what do you guys do with radio surveillance?
What do you mean?
Radio surveillance.
Like
people just reading Wi-Fi's, reading cell phones, they're putting up these fake cell phone towers.
So we do a lot of work on the fake cell towers, or MC catchers, or cell site simulators, or stingrays. We have a whole project right now where we're working on what ways can we do to detect cell site simulators, and what ways can we do to either affect them on a policy level or on a technological level. And that is kind of where most of our resources on that issue is going right now. we did make a conscious choice not to include that in Spot the Surveillance, and the reason is that they aren't visible like the other kinds of things are. I've seen self-site simulators that can fit in a jacket pocket. If they are being driven around a community, they're in a surveillance van, and we didn't want to give the impression of the community that every time you saw a surveillance van that there was somebody like listening to your phones, because we already have enough of a problem with people because of a lot of the fear over it, that there's people like who are just like immediately think that every time something happens weird with their phone, it's a cell site simulator, and so we don't want to overstate the problem. We want it to be more realistic, and so we didn't include that in that.
2 more questions. I think we have time for. Yeah. Yes.
Now that you've done a project in A-frame, would you do another one? What is your overall experience with the tool?
This is something that I go back and forth on a lot because
we've talked about this like all day.
Yeah, because I mean I'm a lover of open source and not proprietary software, and so I really want it to work. But it's just not as widely used as I thought it would be, and getting questions answered has been pretty hard. So I think our next phase that we're launching in April is really just going to be a further build out of this. So I'm definitely going to be using AFib for that, and then we'll see where we are in the spring in terms of what else has been developed. I would prefer to stick with A-frame, but I feel like I don't, because I don't have enough of a supportive environment. It's kind of hard. So we might look at other options.
I'll just throw in that we have an A-frame expert in-house that we're going to connect them with.
Yes. So I'll promise
Chris and Kathy. So we're going to get them in touch with them.
Yeah. And I should add that like WebVR is definitely kind of how we have to go. We don't have an app on the Apple, like an EFF app on the Apple App Store. Like getting through these app stores is like something that's pretty difficult for us to gel with our ethos and our privacy policies and our legal standards. So it's WebVR is kind of like the only way we can really make that work.
Sure.
There's one additional resource in the area that is still publicly working. I haven't checked in the last couple of years. The Cave at Boston University. They have the equipment. They need the projects. If the project's big enough, you've got some super powerful equipment there.
You had a question?
Yeah.
What I was wanting to do was just quickly share more of an anecdotal story having to do with the surveillance. So in 2015, the UK had the distinction of being the most surveyed population in the world, and was talking with a local policeman where I live, and he had been involved in a murder investigation, and they had tracked the victim through a whole sequence of surveillance cameras, and they were looking for, trying to identify, suspect that was involved. And the sad thing is the actual murder took place in a gap between cameras. And so the question becomes, did the suspect know that, or was it accidental? And so when you're talking about, being able for everybody to see where their cameras are, on the one hand, yes, that's great and wonderful from a privacy perspective that we know we're being watched, but can it be misused?
I mean, certainly, in the same way that the surveillance itself could be misused, and I think that it's always a kind of balance between, people who are either cops or criminals doing terrible things, and what we can do to protect ourselves, and what we can do for a balance of making sure there are strong policies in place to protect people, and that can only occur really through transparency.
So we have to wrap it up. We're actually really over time, and I want to make sure that we still have time before the staff have to go home tonight to make sure that you guys all have an opportunity.
A lot of people might not know January has 300 free events at MIT each January.
Okay.
Called IAP, it's in between.
If you send me a link, I will post it up on our site. I'm at MIT every Tuesday, so I'm happy to. I want to thank these guys for coming. I want to thank all of you guys for coming, and